couple of weeks ago, literally only 2 weeks ago, Micah and I went to a really kind of high-end fancy woodworking conference that was in Adelaide. It was a furniture making conference put on by an association of really sort of the highest end sort of artistic furniture makers across Australia. So really, it's a small group. It was a small conference, only about 40 people. It travels, they have a conference each year, it travels around Australia and happened to be in Adelaide, so we went. And so whenever you go to a conference like this, and maybe you've been to conferences like this or get-togethers like this, there's always like two groups of people at a conference like that, right? There's the members of the association, right? So these are the people who mostly travel from interstate and whatever, and these are Australia's, if you're into this and into art and design or whatever, Australia's finest furniture makers, right? People who've got a worldwide profile, and you look at their portfolio and you're just like, dude, how do you do that? And so there's that group of people. So maybe that's half the group. And then the other half of the group are ordinary people like me and Micah, and they're mostly local people who are going like because it's in Adelaide and you know, it's a chance for us to go to something like that. And the conference was pretty good. It was really interesting. They had a bunch of different speakers talking about all sorts of things and showing some of their furniture and stuff. And Micah and I, you know, we learned a stack and came away with lots of ideas for our own business. And we met some really neat people. You know, like any of these things, there's a morning tea and a lunch break and whatever, and you know, you just mill around and you meet some people, and we met some neat people. Some people we're probably going to sort of keep in touch with on the journey. But not one of those really fancy furniture makers ever spoke to me or Micah. Some of you are nodding, you know this experience, right? They all knew each other. They get together once a year with their mates from across Australia, and so they just talk to each other. And they looked like from the outside they were having a great old time. And we were over here talking. Now, the people we talked to were great, right? But they weren't the people who are actually sort of a core that were really into the association, were part of the association, whatever. So at the end of the conference, when the organisers passed around application forms to join the association, how keen do you think I was to fill in the form and join the association, right? Not at all. I went, this was interesting, but these people are clearly not my people. They're not interested in talking to people like me and meeting people like me and hanging out with people like me. And you're all nodding, you've all had the same sort of experience in your life, right? So when we started Tide Church, when a small group of us, really small group of us, like 3 of us, when we started, it doesn't get much smaller than that, when we started thinking and praying and talking about Tide Church, in fact, before it was even Tide Church, when it was just like a church, you can't help but start to have those conversations about what kind of church you want to be, because we'd all been in churches and seen lots of churches. And so we talked a lot about what sort of church we wanted to be, what would be distinctive about Tide Church, where we wanted to go, what we wanted to do. And we came up with this statement. It's written behind me. It stands there on the banner every week, that we as a church, as a group of people, we want to be people who are devoted to Jesus, living our lives following Jesus' example and teaching. And it says at the bottom, wherever we are, no matter the cost. And we said, for us, that's the dream destination, right? That's the light in the distance that we're saying that's where we're headed. And then we come up with 3 more statements and said, well, how are we going to get from here to there? What's the journey look like? What's the path look like between where we are now and between that sort of dream destination? And we came up with these 3 statements: that we will provide an opportunity for people to experience Jesus through worship, communion and community. We'll focus on clear and practical Bible teaching and preaching. And we will empower people, us people, to serve our community and the world. So if you're ever asking, or you're ever thinking, or anyone's ever asking you, this is actually what we're trying to do here every week, right? Everything that you see, all the songs, all the small groups, the coffee, the tea, the whatever, everything that we do sits under one of those three sort of headings or topics or directions somewhere. And finally, out of that, we talked about the kind of people that we want to be along the journey. And actually, more specifically, we talked about the kind of people that we believed Jesus wanted us to be along the journey. Because you've heard me say this a million times. A church isn't an organisation. A church isn't a building. A church is a community of people, right? So I say this all the time, that you don't go to church, you don't belong to a church, you are a church. And the point of that is that then, what that means is that when someone asks you, or when you think, or someone says, hey, you go to Tide Church, what's Tide Church like? The answer to that question is that, well, Tide Church is like us, right? Because we are Tide Church. So what we say and how we behave and the things that we do and how we live, we are Tide Church, and Tide Church is us, all of us, not me, not the musicians out the front, all of us are Tide Church. And so we asked, what kind of people do we want to be at Tide Church? And we came up with 6 behaviours that we hope will be core for every person who calls this place home, every person who says, I'm a part of what it is to be Tide Church. We said that we want to be people who behave with love. Absolute love, kind of, we say, devoted to Jesus, love toward God and love toward other people. We want love to be the number one thing that characterises someone who says they're part of Tide. We've talked about we want to be people who behave with grace, people who experience the grace of God. That sort of the definition sometimes is the unmerited favour, the grace, the thing that God pours us. We don't deserve it. We didn't do anything to earn it. It's just God's goodness given to us in spite of who we are. We want to experience that, and then we want to pass on that grace. We want to be sort of conduits of that grace to the world around us, and to share that grace with other people who are here and people who we meet in our day-to-day lives. We want to be people who behave with a kind of joy, a joy that doesn't come from our circumstances, but a joy that comes from knowing and living with Jesus. A joy that you can have when things are going really well and when your finances are fantastic and your job's great and your family's awesome, but a joy that stays when you're in the other places too, because it's not dependent on the circumstances, it's dependent on who God is. We want to be people who behave with generosity, being generous with our time and with our money and with our stuff toward God, but also toward other people. We want to be people who live with a belief that God has given us so much, that God is the provider of everything we have. So sharing the stuff we have with others is a no-brainer, right? Because it all comes from God, and there's when I say there's plenty more, God is abundant and limitless in the things that He gives us. So we can be generous toward other people in the world around us. We want to be people of faith. People who behave with a kind of faith that says we believe that God is alive. We believe that God, through His Holy Spirit, is acting to change us and to change the world around us. That's what faith is, a rock-solid belief that the Holy Spirit is at work in the world today. And finally, and this is what we're going to talk about today, we said we want to be people who behave with hospitality and inclusivity. We want to be people who are welcoming and friendly to all people. That's all people inside the church, all people outside the church. We want to be the sort of people who take the first step in welcoming and engaging other people. So we're not just friendly to people who are friendly to us. We want to be the ones who take the step and initiate friendliness and initiate love and generosity and those sorts of things with people around us. We want to be a church who creates opportunities for people to connect and to enjoy and to grow with one another in a sense of community. Now, I think we're going to talk about this last one today because a good question to ask, a fair question to ask is, why would a Christian church think that inclusivity and hospitality is so important? Because honestly, I don't know, when you look at the list, words like love and grace and joy and faith, you kind of expect to hear those words in church, right? They're churchy words, and everyone talks about those kind of words. But when you see words like inclusivity and hospitality, where does a church get off talking about that sort of stuff? Well, we talk about that because we follow Jesus, and hospitality and inclusivity was important to Jesus. Hospitality and inclusivity was a big part of who Jesus was and the way he lived. In fact, hospitality and inclusivity was such a big part of who Jesus was that it surprised people around him. Jesus was so inclusive of everyone, and I mean everyone. He was so inclusive of people. He was so hospitable. He was so warm and welcoming and engaging and inviting of other people that it surprised people around him. It surprised people that anyone would be so inclusive and so hospitable. I want to tell you share with you one of the surprising stories, one of the stories where Jesus' hospitality and inclusivity really surprised people. So we're going to jump, if you've got a Bible, we're going to jump to Mark chapter 2. The boys' names, 2/3 of the way through your Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Mark's one of the guys that writes a biography of Jesus' life. And this is right at the beginning of that story. Now, we're going to read this story from the Gospel of Mark, but if you want to make notes, Matthew and Luke tell the same story, almost kind of word for word, the same story. But we're going to read Mark's version of the story today. This is a story that really surprised the people who were there and who heard it and watched it unfold. So this is Mark chapter 2. I'm going to start reading at verse 13. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. Now, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And on hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." The story starts with these words. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. Now, the words "once again" mean that Mark is connecting this story with something that's happened before, right? Because it's once again. He's saying, we've seen Jesus do something before and he's about to do the same something again. Now, this is only in chapter 2 of Mark, so it's kind of easy. If you skim back through the first, it's probably only page or two of Mark. If you get to Mark, and don't look this up, but you can look this up later. If you get to Mark chapter 1, verse 16, you'll see another story that starts with Jesus walking beside a lake. It's the story, you read it through, it's only a few verses. It's the story where Jesus first meets Peter and Andrew, and he recruits them, he invites them to join his team. It's the story where as he invites them, he says they're fishermen, they're down by the lake, because that's where their boats are, right? They've done a day's fishing, he walks along the lake, he meets them, they're working on their nets, and he says, "Hey, come with me, follow me, and I will make you, together we will be fishers of men, fishers of people," and they follow him. So when Mark starts this story with "once again," and he says, "Once again, Jesus is down by the lake," your brain's supposed to go straight away, right, this is going to be another story about Jesus probably meeting another fisherman, and this is probably going to be a story about "come follow me." This is probably going to be a story about fishers of men, because that's kind of where the last story goes, right? This is Mark saying, this is once again, Jesus is doing the same thing again. But then the story twists, because Jesus doesn't talk to the fishermen by the lake. All of a sudden, Jesus is having a conversation with a tax collector. Now, that's the first big surprise, right? Because no one went out of their way to have a conversation with a tax collector. Nobody liked tax collectors. And nobody who was recruiting a team of people to do anything would ever recruit a tax collector, because we've talked about this before, but tax collectors were, in that culture, were criminals and traitors. We might even call them scumbags, but I didn't want to write that on the on the screen. So 2,000 years ago, when this story takes place, the Roman Empire is at its peak, and the Roman Empire have conquered most of what people thought then was the ends of the earth and the known world. The Roman Empire had conquered Israel, they'd conquered Jerusalem and the surrounds where this story takes place. The Roman Empire was funded by taxes that they collected from the lands that they conquered. And so what the Roman authorities, the Roman administrators would do is they would look at the population and the means of an area, and they would decide how much tax should be collected, should be given to Rome from that area, right? Make sense? And then what they would do is they would recruit local people, not Roman people. They would recruit local people to collect the tax. But they didn't pay those local people. The local people, those tax collectors, could collect however much tax they want. They could set their own rate for what people would have to pay in tax. And as long as at the end of the day they gave Rome the amount that Rome wanted, they could keep the rest. And so what the tax collectors would do is they would set a really high rate of tax. They would say, well, Rome wants this. They would set a really high rate of tax. They would bribe the local Roman soldiers to force people to pay the exorbitant rates of tax. And they would be charging people so much tax that they could afford to pay the bribe, to skim off the top and pay a bribe to the Roman soldiers and still get filthy rich themselves. And everybody knew this, and so everybody hated tax collectors. Because tax collectors were working for the enemy. Remember, Rome had come in and had conquered, with swords and swords and shields and stuff. So they'd been conquered in a military way. And so the tax collectors are working for the enemy. But at the same time, they doubly hated the tax collectors, because not only were they working for the enemy, but they were doing it by stealing from their own people. Right? They were extorting money for their own people, for their own purposes. So the only friends that a tax collector had were other tax collectors, and were other outcasts and scumbags who would hang out with tax collectors because nobody liked them either. So if nobody's going to like me, I might as well be nobody like me and hang out with the local rich guy in town because the tax collectors were really wealthy. Make sense? And Jesus goes out of his way to start a conversation with Levi, who's a tax collector. And he says in verse 14, "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi gets up and follows him. Now, Levi later, not in this story, but in subsequent stories, Levi will be renamed Matthew. He will become Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, and Matthew who wrote the Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. That Matthew, right? This is the guy. Now, this whole story might not seem like it to you, but this is a shocking story to anyone who reads this story. I mean, honestly, this is not an exaggeration to say. Jesus recruiting Levi into his group is like your kid's high school employing a drug dealer to teach business to high school kids. Do you know what I mean? It is like, dude, no one does that. Jesus recruiting Levi to his small group is like your workplace recruiting a criminal, a professional thief to run their payroll, right? You just wouldn't do that. These are not the people that you want doing that job. No one recruits Levi. And then the story gets even more crazy, and you might have skipped over this, but verse 15 says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house. Now you ought to read that and go, what? Hang on, scroll back. Did I miss something? Jesus went back to this guy's house for dinner? It says, well, Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house. many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Jesus takes his small group, his disciples, his people, and they all go to Levi's house for dinner. And Levi invites all of his people, right? All the scumbags and all the criminals and all the prostitutes and all the friends that he's got. And he invites them, and they all have this huge dinner together. If you read Luke's version of the story, Luke describes this as a banquet. Jesus and his mates and Levi and his mates all eating and partying together. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with them and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the teachers of the law and the Pharisees saw him, because they hear about this, and so they're sort of at the windows and the doors, and they're kind of sussing this out like peak judgment here. When they saw him eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, you have to get your Bible nerd on to get this next bit, but you know how I always talk to you about the power of repeated words in the Bible? Do you notice the repeated word in here? Jesus was having dinner with them. He was eating with them. He saw them eating. Does he eat? 4 times it mentions that Jesus and his disciples were eating with Levi and his mates. Mark wants you to see that Jesus wasn't just coincidentally in the same place as Levi and his mates. He wasn't just hanging out with them like you might at a football game where, I'm there and they're there and, we're just kind of in the same place at the same time. He wants you to know that they were eating together. Now, if you were walking past my house and you saw me talking out the front of my house to a known convicted drug dealer, you might think, that's interesting. Wonder if Matt realises who that guy is. If you saw me invite that same guy into my house, then you might think to yourself, wow, does Matt know this guy? But if you came into my house and you saw me eating dinner with that guy and my family and his drug dealing friends, and I'm serious, this is the story. This is not an exaggeration, this is the story. And if you saw me eating with them and we're talking and we're laughing and whatever, you would think to yourself, wow, Matt is friends with this guy. This is exactly what's happening in this story. This is what's happening. To eat with someone is a level of connection and a level of approval and a level of friendship that is very different than just talking to someone you pass in the street. It was exactly the same. And Mark wants you to see very clearly that Jesus was eating with Levi and his mates. In other words, this isn't just a story about how Levi joined the group. Mark wants you to see the kind of person that Jesus is. This actually isn't a story about Levi at all. This is a story about Jesus. This is a story about who Jesus is, the way he got around, the kind of people that he chose to bring into his group, and the way that he related to people like Levi. Mark wants you to see how inclusive Jesus was. Mark wants you to see Jesus' heart for hospitality toward other people. Yeah. But not everyone liked what they saw. You read on, it says, when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, that when they saw him eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked the disciples, why does he eat with sinners and tax collectors? Jesus hears it. And he says to everyone who's there, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Yeah. I haven't come to call the righteous, that's the people who are outside doing the judging, I haven't come to call those people, but sinners, the people who are sitting around the table with him. Jesus looks around the party. He looks around the room and he sees his friends and Levi's friends, and he sees a table full of half-finished food, and he sees drinks all over the place, and he hears laughter and chatting and conversation and probably live music, and Jesus looks around at it all, and he sees the faces in the window and at the door of the important and influential and socially cool people of that time. That's who the Pharisees were. The Pharisees, they were the people whose house you wanted to get an invite to, and they're the ones on the outside looking in and judging. And Jesus looks at those influential people judging on the outside, and he looks at Levi and his mates, along with Jesus' mates on the inside, and he says, "This is who I am." Jesus says, "These are my people. These are the people who most need me. These are the people who are the reason I'm here. These are the people who I came for." I don't want you to miss, and this is where we're going today, that inclusivity and hospitality were at the very heart of who Jesus was as a person. And so for us, inclusivity and hospitality are at the heart of this church too. Inclusivity and hospitality are at the heart of this church too. Because if you've been around Tide for a bit, you've heard me say a million times that being a Christian isn't just about what you believe, it is also about what you do and how you live. And we've been saying a lot recently that the goal of a modern day disciple, the follower of Jesus, the people who want to be with him and follow him, the goal of a modern day disciple is to be with Jesus, to be like Jesus, and to do as Jesus did. And we said this is what we're trying to be all about here in this church. And so when we say hospitality and inclusivity, when we say that's who Jesus was, well, it's like join the dots. If that's who Jesus was, and we're trying to be like Jesus and do what Jesus did, then we're going to have to be a church that is open to everyone. We're going to have to be a church that is not just inviting in a, well, I guess they can come in and sit up the back kind of way, but that is actively inviting in the same way that Jesus actively invited, that is actively inviting everybody to be a part of the community here. Yeah. We're going to have to be a church, as Jesus was a person, that has hospitality at its heart. But of course, what Jesus is doing here isn't just about what happens inside a church. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, but Jesus at this point in the story doesn't invite Levi and his mates to church at all. He goes to their house and has dinner with them and hangs with them long before any of them have ever thought about coming to church and reading the Bible and doing all of the right things. And so the question we're going to ask ourselves today in our small groups is this one. We're going to ask ourselves, what does Jesus-style hospitality and inclusive look like in my life today? What does it look like in your life today? What does this kind of hospitality and inclusivity, what does that look like for someone who goes to uni where you go to uni, who works in the job that you work, the job that you work in, who lives in the street that you work in, who lives in the house that you work in, who enjoys doing the stuff that you enjoy doing out of work? What does Jesus-style hospitality look like in my life today? And the answer to that might be something that happens in and around here and in and around the church, but it might be about something that happens in your Monday to Saturday, right? Yeah. And it's convenient to talk about this because over the next 6 weeks, lots of us, maybe most of us, are going to find ourselves in parties and end-of-year gatherings and work dinners and things with friends and whatever in the lead up to Christmas. And so we're also going to ask these questions in our small groups this morning. We're going to ask, who are you going to invite? Who are you going to talk to? Who are you going to eat with? These are the questions that when you read this story from Jesus, these are the questions that story ought to be asking you. Yeah. Right? When Jesus says, this is how I was, well, if you're going to follow me, if you want to be part of my team, if you want to take the invite that Levi took and come follow me, these are the questions that this story ought to ask us. Who are you going to invite? Who are you going to talk to? And who are you going to eat with? And I'm serious. I'm dead serious when I say the way you answer those questions could change someone else's life forever. Because make no mistake, this Jesus-style hospitality changes people's lives. Like what happened in that story changed Levi's life forever. In that moment, Jesus stops being a tax collector and becomes a follower of Jesus. He will literally change his name as a way to say the transformation in me is so different. Don't even call me Levi anymore. Start calling me Matthew. I want a whole new identity. That's how radical the change is in me. And he will go on to be the guy who will write the biography of Jesus that we're still, you know what I mean? Like reading 2,000 years later, St. Matthew, and we have church. This is the scumbag tax collector who we now see as like this epic follower of Jesus, wrote the Bible guy. And it started because Jesus reached out to him with a level of inclusivity and hospitality that made everyone around them, even Jesus' mates, go, dude, are you serious? Are we really going there? This kind of hospitality and inclusivity changes people's lives forever. It changed Levi's life. It changed the lives of Levi's scumbag mates for sure. And it still changes the lives of people today. And in fact, and this is just my thinking, you might disagree with this, but I actually reckon the more our world get obsessed by screens, the more our world get obsessed by our own lives, like the more my life starts becoming about me, and the more I want to tell the whole rest of the world that it ought to be catering for me and everyone should be thinking about me and it's all about me and me and me. The more our world becomes divided and judgmental, and the more that I look at other people, and the more that we look at other people and say, well, you don't believe like me, so I hate you, and you don't vote the way I do, and you don't... Do you know what I mean? Like the more we get like that, actually the more Jesus-style hospitality will set the church apart. The more the world gets like that, the more crazy the answers to these kinds of questions have the potential to become, right? Because we're in a world where you only eat with people who tick all... They've got to vote like me, they've got to look like me. Do you know what I mean? I'm not hanging out with people who don't, dun, 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 dun. The more our world gets away from this kind of living, the more this kind of living has the potential to change the lives of people in our world. Earlier this year, our family had a couple of young Japanese guys come stay with us as part of a school exchange program. They were just here for a week. When the boys get home, they have to write a report, right? Maybe it's 500,000 word report on their time in Australia. And, they write about the things that they've seen and the things that they've done and what they experienced and how different the culture is and yada, 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 right? Well, not the boy that stayed at our house. This is what Shun wrote. This is part of his. It's a long thing, and I've just picked out a few lines. But these are Shun's words. Well, translated. I don't read Japanese, so I suppose this is what he wrote. Okay, this is what the Japanese teacher said that Shun wrote. It's a 16-year-old Japanese boy. He said, "What impressed me most about my host family's home was the warmth of their family bond. He went on, he said a little bit later, he said, I could tell that their kindness wasn't just for guests. They truly had a close relationship with one another. They shared chores and meals. I don't know who was sharing the chores, but must have been some other kids in my house that night. He said, they shared chores and meals, they worked together, and I never saw anyone doing things alone. Another part of the letter he writes, we rarely had meals with just the family. There was always someone visiting or joining us. He says, we became close quickly, especially after playing cards. Here's a note. Apparently, you know is a universal language, right? And you can bond with anyone in any language if you play with them. Anyway, that's by the by. The last thing I wrote from it, he says, their friends and relatives, some of those people are in this room today, their friends and relatives were also friendly and talked with us a lot. That blew me away. I had no idea that inviting these boys into our family for 1 week could make that kind of impact on them. And don't get me wrong, like our family is not perfect. We are, ask my children, right? We are a million miles from perfect. But this is the point, right? You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be amazing. We live in a world that is so devoid of inclusivity and hospitality that you can even just like kind of half get this right and it'll blow people away, right? If you will welcome people, if you will include people, if you will open your home, both sort of metaphorically, but also literally, actually invite people into your home. If you will practice Jesus-style hospitality, it will impact people in a way that you could never imagine. And the same is true for us as a church, right? If we together as a community, if we will welcome people into this church family, if we will include people, if we will practice Jesus-style hospitality as a group to people who venture through the doors here, you have no idea the potential that has to impact people's lives forever. And I mean forever, as in like this life and into eternity kind of forever. That's why we put inclusivity and hospitality on the list, right? That's why we want this thing. That's why we believe this thing ought to be so important to who we are as a church. It's why it's so important to the kind of church that we want to be. So we're going to move into our small groups. I'm going to leave these questions up here. I'm going to invite you. Often the small groups, kind of go wherever, talk whatever. I'm going to invite you to sort of just jump straight to the punchline and go straight to these questions and have an honest conversation about them. And I just want to remind you, I think most of you know this, but I just want to remind you, our small groups are open discussions. There are no right answers. We don't want to be the judges on the outside windows looking in at other people and other people's lives, right? This is a place to listen to each other, to learn and to grow. Our small groups, our desire, our heart, is that our small groups are a place where everyone has an opportunity to take their next step with Jesus. And I say that's important because all of us are at different places in the journey with Jesus right now. Right? So everyone's next step today is going to look different. Like some of you are kind of well on the way to this, and so you're going to start thinking about and maybe talking about, hospitality and inclusivity at this level. And there are going to be others in your group who've never done this and never had anyone in their home and never invited. And they're going to be talking about, stepping from here to here. And that's okay, right? So it's really important in our groups today that when we answer these questions, you're asking these questions for you. Right? What does Jesus want to do for you today? And recognizing that for others in the group, they may be at a really different place in their journey. But wherever it is, our discussion this morning is a chance for you to think about and talk about and work through what Jesus-style hospitality and inclusivity might look like in your life.